we all ready here? You're going to get a history lesson, right? Just what you wanted. Okay. So I'm Bob Rydzewski, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the old days here. It's good to see your smiling faces. But what I'm going to talk about now, if I was going to tell you about fake news and private messages being hacked and military secrets leaked and obscenities ruling the airwaves, you might think I was talking about today, right? But actually, I'm talking about 1905, and I'm talking about right here in Alameda. This stuff was going on within a 10-minute walk of where we are today. Isn't that amazing? So if there were a lot of similarities to today, there are also a lot of differences. And things we take for granted, they couldn't because they hadn't thought of them yet. So broadcasting, for example, did not exist. You had a radio to replace like a telegram. It was person to person, point to point. The ability of people to be able to listen in was considered a vulnerability, right? You didn't want that. Companies that existed back then were all pretty much, with very few exceptions, stock frauds. So they'd send a salesman to town, he'd set up a station, he'd talk people into handing over their money for stock certificates that were very beautifully engraved, and those people would disappear with the money in their pockets and never be heard of again. So for this reason, wireless was considered a kind of had a bad reputation at the beginning, and they called it wireless originally. Radio was a term that came in a little later. And in the earliest days here, they could not really send out voice or music. It had to be those buzzy Morse code, you know, zzz, zzz, zzz. They sent out with sparks, and that's what you get with sparks. The technology was not there to send out voice and music because they didn't have tubes, they didn't have transistors, you know, so these sets you're bidding on, these are futuristic to them. They're 20 years in the future at minimum. So, you know, and they didn't even have crystals. You think of crystal radios as being like the earliest ones. Well, actually, they had ones before that. They hadn't come up with crystals yet, right? And in fact, you couldn't buy a radio. There was no store, unless you were maybe the U.S. Navy and you got defense contractors to build them for you. So what you had to do was DIY, right, with parts found around your house. And this was kind of a high-tech thing. And so who got into it? The teenage boys, right? It was like the hacking of their day. They would, you know, take stuff out of the house and take Dad's spark coil out of his car, and they would put together their own transmitters and receivers. And the biggest difference between then and now is they had no laws at all regulating what you could do. Whatever you felt like, whatever you were capable of doing, it was okay. So it was not illegal to transmit anything at any power at any time. You could curse on the air, you could threaten people, you could pretend to be somebody else. It sounds like now, doesn't it? and well, unlike now, you could listen in on Navy messages because the U.S. Navy didn't think they had to encrypt anything. They just sent things out in the clear. Who was going to listen, right? Well, these teenage kids hanging around, they listened. And they could send the news of what the ships were doing to their friends and family and put it in the papers, whatever. If you got mad at someone on the air, you could drown them out and basically jam their signal. You know, there's nothing illegal. You could send out a fake SOS. That was the worst thing. And it happened a few times where the Coast Guard ships would go looking for a wreck that wasn't there. And even though it's morally reprehensible, it was not technically illegal. And any lawyer will tell you those are two different things, right? So I'm going to talk about the first couple of teenagers here in Alameda. Alameda had a lot of these kind of pioneers. And on the left is Henry Heim, and on the right is Albert Wolf, Jr. They were pals. They went to Alameda High before that high school down the block was even there. They were Alameda High students. And Henry's father was a Swiss immigrant who came here, and he had built up a business making candy and ice cream and cake and selling it on Park Street, you know, just down there.
About what year?
Well, Henry's father came around in the, I think, early 1890s.
Cool.
And so he was here for a while. So the kids would get the news. They had their receivers, and they could get news on the wireless, and the newspaper reporters would hang around because they didn't have any radios, and so they would get their news through the kids. And so here's some of the articles that, you know, they they put into the papers, wrecks at sea, results of the yacht race. Maybe you had money on that and you wanted to know. So all kinds of interesting stuff. But so at first they were viewed as kind of heroes and high-tech young inventors. A few years later, it changed to suspicion because here's a headline: Alameda boys construct wireless and intercept government messages, bear Navy secrets, take billets from officers. And so there's Henry and Albert in this picture from the San Francisco Call, I think it is. Whoops, I'll go back. And Henry had his, you had to have an antenna that was up high. Henry Heim had his from the store up to a water tower on Park Street, and Albert here had his antenna hooked up to the top of a windmill in the backyard of his house here in Alameda. And those were used to pull up water from the wells, right? So they were accused of several things, and this made it all the way to Washington. Although it wasn't illegal, it made good, sensationalistic news stories. So they were accused of passing along Navy secrets. Well, how secret was it if they didn't bother to encrypt anything? They were embarrassing the Navy because in the early days of Navy wireless, the ship captains didn't like it because it took away their autonomy. If they were out of sight of other ships, they would normally be the captain of their ship on their own. Now you had some pimply-faced kid in the wireless shack telling you the admiral says you have to do this, the admiral says you have to do that. So they tended to ignore it as much as possible, and in the absence of strict discipline, they called it circuit discipline later, the officers on the ship would set up dates with their girlfriends ashore. That was one of the earliest uses of Navy radio. And here's one that says that Henry and Albert intercepted. It says, to Mrs. Something, Alameda, we'll see you tonight. Didn't like to take too many chances yesterday. We must be discreet. And it's signed the lieutenant, and then there was another one from Bluebeard. So they had all this kind of stuff going on. The kids couldn't help trying to impersonate an officer to see if they can get a ship to turn around, just to see, And ironically, the person they tried to pretend they were was a rear admiral who was involved in trying to get the Navy to control all of radio, which didn't happen. But anyway, so what they were doing made it into the congressional record in Washington, D.C., and there was a call, not only because of these kids, they weren't the only ones, there were others around the country, but theirs got more publicity than most, and they got into the congressional record. There was a push to pass a radio law so that you couldn't do all these bad things we talked about. And eventually that happened. The kids were afraid that if they passed any law, these amateur radio guys would be completely out of business and they wouldn't let them on the air. But it turned out they worked out a compromise, right? You got to get a license. You got to follow the rules. You can't do all those bad things or we'll throw you in jail. So that's what happened finally in the U.S. in 1912. Now, Henry came to a very sad end. It's like they say, truth is stranger than fiction. He worked as an electrician in Bolinas at the Marconi Spark Station that was transmitting to Hawaii. It was a 300 kilowatt station, if you can imagine. And he was electrocuted in an accident there in 1914. And if that wasn't bad enough, okay, how can it get worse, right? Well, they're bringing him back to the Fowler Funeral Home in Alameda, and the driver runs off the road near San Quentin. The van overturns, and the only way they can get at Henry's remains is to have the prisoner trustees go out and retrieve them, return them to Alameda where he was cremated, and it's a pretty sad story. Let's talk about something happier. This is Fred Mudgett. Fred lived at 2307 Santa Clara Avenue. And let me ask you this. Does anybody recognize this building? There's the vice mayor here. Yeah. It looks pretty old. It's City Hall, but there's a difference. It has this big tower in the middle, right? And if you look at it today, well, this little greenhouse behind the flower shop, that was Fred Mudgett's house. He had an antenna hooked up from there to the top of the flagpole on top of the tower at City Hall. It was the highest point around. And if I went to the planning department today and I said, hey, can I put up my antenna over Oak Street and all the way to the top of your building, I'm sure they'd say, yeah, sure, go ahead. But that's what he did. Right? So Fred actually was kind of a hero, because when the earthquake struck in San Francisco in 1906, for a while, all of the city's communications were out, right? So if you wanted to get a message around, you had to get in a boat, sail across the bay. You had to try to get down the peninsula. But within hours, the Army Signal Corps strung up some wires. And they worked out a system where the wires would go to the ferry building. They got a radio aboard the USS Chicago, one of the few Navy wireless-equipped ships, as part of the chain. The signal would go from there to Yerba Buena Island, and then to Mare Island, where they had telegraph lines, so they could communicate. And this is what a Navy radio station, high-tech station, looked like back then. But one of the links in this chain failed, and at that point, Fred Mudgett of Alameda became the only link from San Francisco to the outside world, which is rather remarkable because no one's ever heard of this, but it's apparently true. And he also worked for a local paper, the Encinal, and so the reports got to the Alameda readers probably before they got to anyone else in the world. And this is something that's very much forgotten now, but here's a picture of Fred. He graduated from Berkeley with a degree in mining engineering, and he helped save lives during the earthquake. He was the only way that some of those messages were getting out with his station on Santa Clara Avenue. This was probably the very first example of any amateur radio operator being of utility during a disaster. Later on, there's during floods, wildfires, and stuff. We know that the amateur radio helps, but Fred Mudgett was probably the very first person to ever do that, and he's from Alameda. By the time he died in 1951, nobody remembered it, and he definitely deserves better. And then finally, I'm going to end with a story of a gentleman who had quite a few adventures in his long life, and you can see he was also an Alameda hero. His name was George S. Hubbard, and he lived a long life, and he had lived for a while at 1112 College Avenue in Alameda. He took some electric courses in Wilmerding High School in San Francisco, and he studied on his own, and he wanted to become a Sparks, which was a ship wireless operator. And he did take the test in San Francisco, and he was one of the very first professional licensed radio operators in the United States. He was probably within the first dozen people who ever had a federal license to operate a radio. He went to sea, and after the Titanic disaster in 1912, these guys had a lot going for them. Public loved them, right, because they could save lives. In this cartoon, which you probably can't see too well, the wireless man is telling this female passenger, nowadays, the captain on the ship is a small potato compared to the wireless operator. And if you see a similarity between this and a picture of George Hubbard, well, I do too. And on George's right, your left, is Bertha, who, I think I'm right about that. And that would, Bertha, he met on board ship. He proposed within hours. They married the next day, and they lived in Alameda for some time. Now, before that, he had already been in one major incident. He'd been the wireless man on the SS Asia, which was coming from China to San Francisco, when they ran into a rock in the fog. And he talks about, it's a great story. I don't have a whole lot of time for it, unfortunately. He got knocked out of bed. He said the ship bumped up and down and heeled to port. It was wrecked on what's called Finger Rock, which is south of Taiwan. And the lives of all 300 people depended on George Hubbard. George made it to the wireless, he made it from the wireless room to the captain, because basically he had to get the order to send an SOS, right? And he had to know where they were, because you can't send an SOS if you don't, there's no GPS, right? So he found the captain firing a rusty old pistol at a bunch of Chinese sampans that were approaching, which they thought were pirates coming to loot the ship. George made it back. He got his order. He got the spark transmitter working. He sent out the signal, and within 5 minutes, he said 3 ships responded, and they were coming to save them all. Now, George came back as a hero, but if that wasn't enough for one lifetime, he had more adventures, and we'll tell you a little more about those, but not much. He survived a tsunami off the Columbia River bar by clinging to the mast of a ship. he was painting a radio tower in Southern California when an earthquake struck, and that almost knocked him off. It's like Mother Nature's against this guy, right? And then finally, he became a civilian contractor to the Navy with radio at Pearl Harbor. And he was there in 1941 on December 7th and has a fascinating account, which unfortunately we don't have time to go much into. But he survived that experience. And then, that wasn't enough. He was given an appointment with a Dr. Lawrence in Berkeley. And this was Ernest O. Lawrence, who, you know, Lawrence Livermore, Lawrence Berkeley. And Dr. Lawrence hired him and called him the gadgeteer because he could string together equipment in a jiffy, right? And he was working at the 184-inch cyclotron at Berkeley, which was part of the Manhattan Project at the time. So George had quite a career, and then he was also, last but not least, he was a charter founder of the Society of Wireless Pioneers. That's the organization that we have their archives right there in that building, and it allows us to find out all this neat stuff that would otherwise be forgotten. So the conclusions are, next time you reach for your smartphone, think about those teenage hackers back in the old days who were part of the process originally of developing radio. And remember that the city of Alameda had more than its share of pioneers, like Henry, Albert, Fred, and George. And they impacted what we would later know as radio. It was called wireless at the time. I'd like to thank all these people, especially now, I know Gary's here. Stand up, Gary. This is this grandson of George Hubbard. Gary was, and his brother Dennis. They remember Grandpa, and they managed to preserve his autobiography. So they're working on getting it published, and we hope to be able to see it in print very soon. So I think, do you have time, any time for questions, or are we out? No? Okay, any questions?
I still haven't.
Okay, if you have think of anything, come see me later. Thank you.